Welcome, everyone. My name is Wayne Waters, and I'm a strategic and policy advisor with McCarthy Tétrault. And prior to joining McCarthy Tétrault, I spent 37 years in the public service of Canada, culminating as clerk of the Privy Council, secretary to cabinet, and head of the public service. And I want to welcome everyone here this morning, wherever you are in Canada. Glad you could be with us to discuss a really topical set of issues, the key insights for Canada's LNG sector. We've seen a lot of ups and downs in the Canadian LNG sector over the past decade, but I think many of us still remain very optimistic. And so today we want to look at some of the factors that lead to that particular conclusion. We encourage you to use your video feature so we can see who is online today, but it's optional. If you don't want to do so, that's your choice. We will be taking questions at the end of today's panel session. And so if you'd like to ask a question in advance, just please use the chat function located at the bottom of your screen, or you can simply wait until we're completed our panel discussion and ask questions at that point. Now, I'm very pleased to have three very knowledgeable panelists with us here today, and let me introduce them. First, let me introduce you to Dave Nicolaisian, who has recently joined McCarthy as a strategic and policy advisor. Dave has just retired from the government of British Columbia, where he served as Deputy Minister of Energy, Mines, and Petroleum Resources. And in this role, Dave led the province through several very high-profile mining and oil and gas projects, and he was very instrumental in getting a final decision by the government of BC to proceed with the LNG Canada project. So welcome to the panel, Dave. You can just give a wave. Let me introduce next Selina Lee Anderson. Selina is a partner with our Environmental, Regulatory, and Aboriginal Law Group at McCarthy Tétrault. She specializes in environmental regulatory matters, including climate change law, environmental assessments, and offset systems. Selina is an expert as well in Aboriginal law matters. Welcome, Selina. And last but not least, let me introduce you to Paul Cassidy. Paul is a partner in our business law group at McCarthy Tétrault and is co-head of our National Environmental, Regulatory, and Aboriginal group. Paul is recognized as one of Canada's leading environmental and energy lawyers. Welcome, Paul. So those are our panelists. Let's get right to it. We've got a lot of matters to cover. So I'm going to turn first to you, Dave. Let me pose my first question. First, Canada, can you provide us with a bit of a scene setter, if you will, for the LNG sector in Canada? How has LNG evolved to date, and what are the prospects for the future? Does LNG still hold a lot of promise here in Canada? Dave.
Thanks for the question, and welcome everyone, and thank you for your time this morning. And I'd like to answer that question as far as scene setting by just talking about my personal experiences and journey around LNG in British Columbia and Canada. So I've actually had the pleasure of working for two different administrations in British Columbia, leading the LNG file, and I've gone through kind of the entire journey, starting back, coming out of the 2013 election in British Columbia. It was very much the gold rush LNG times. Projects were being built all over the world. Canada wanted to join the party. It was a super high priority of the government of the day. And at one time we had greater than 20 projects predicted to deliver more than 80 megatons per annum of LNG into the world market. And just for context, the world market at that time was only slightly over 200. So it gives you a sense for our ambition back in the day. All of that kind of over time, because supply caught up with demand, price started to go down, those projects started to disappear. And I would say I lived through the darkest days of LNG in Canada as well. Shortly after the 2017 election, when Pacific Northwest LNG, which was the leading contender to be the first LNG project in Canada, notified Canada and British Columbia that we were not going to proceed, which is a very disappointing time. And to the credit of both the Canadian and BC governments of the day, rather than be dismayed and fold up our tents, it created a new focus on LNG, which led to a reemergence of optimism around the positive final investment decision that LNG Canada made in 2018, which is a mega project in its own right, 14 megatons per annum in phase one. And that really created a brand new interest in Canada and the opportunity that is Canadian LNG. And we saw a lot of companies basically taking the attitude, if 5 of the biggest, smartest companies in the world could make a go of it in Canada, building a greenfield LNG project, what are we missing? And I can tell you from my old role, there was lots of people coming back to Canada to take another look. And there are still some very much going concern projects. We don't talk about them as much anymore in the headlines, but there's lots of projects still happening in Canada as we speak, trying to get going. There's LNG Canada Phase 2. We've got the Wood Fibre LNG project in Squamish. We've got the Kitimat LNG project, which is the Woodside Chevron, soon to be Woodside someone else partnership in Kitimat. We've got Cedar LNG, which is the Haisla project that will take gas from Coastal GasLink pipeline. We've got Rockies LNG up in the Nisga'a territory there. And so there's others also looking around too, as I said. And so optimism is back, and I think our best days are actually still ahead of us.
Thank you. Sorry, Dave, I was on mute. I guess when you look at an LNG capacity has been built up around the world, whether that's in Asia or Australia or the US, aren't we a bit late coming to the party? Yes, we have a major project underway, but are we going to be able to compete with these other LNG facilities? Some are latent facilities. How do you see that? How do you see our standing in the world if we were to move forward with some of these projects?
It's a great question, and it's a really important question, because there's no doubt we are late to the party. We missed that gold rush largely, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I would say, it could be an advantage on 2 different dimensions. First of all, we can learn the lessons of those mega projects, especially in Australia, and cost overruns and infrastructure and so on, and how to do it better. But I would say, much more importantly, the context that we're trying to exist within has massively changed. And that's all about climate change and the interest in ESG corporately and what's happening there. And if you think about a decade ago till today and the journey that has been, the context for these projects is very different. And I think Canada has a huge advantage. And I have a few slides I'm just going to quickly share with folks here, just to kind of help set context. And there's a few things and just snapshots. This slide is from a recently released IEA World Energy Report, and it's the first point that really kind of reflects back on the climate change point, which is the growth and importance of renewables, particularly solar PV. And so you've got this, sorry, I'll just quickly slide through these. That's full screen. So if you look where we are in 2020, it's indisputably true, no matter which scenario you'd like to choose, that the best days of renewables are ahead of us as far as growth goes. And when you look at renewables, solar PV is going to take off. The cost for producing new capacity generated by solar PV is approaching, the cost we can do with any source. And so it is true that renewables are growing and solar PV is going to lead the way. It's also true that some of this growth and interest in renewables is being driven also from the corporate sector. So this is a slide from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which shows the exploding growth that's happening around corporations entering the power purchase market as part of their sustainability goals as corporations. So you've got the Walmarts, the Amazons, Microsofts of the world, a lot of the banks. out as part of their core values around corporate sustainability, saying we want to move to net zero. We want to be zero emissions corporations, and how they're doing that is by entering the energy markets themselves and buying energy. And whether those projects actually attach, to their facilities is not the point. The point is they get credits from doing this as part of their sustainability metrics. So it's also true that corporations are behind a lot of this renewables growth. It's also true that renewables are still a very small slice of the overall primary energy supply mix of the planet. So if you look at this chart, there's variations all over the place, but they all show the same thing. As fast as renewables are growing and as important as they are, and as true as it is that solar PV is taking off, primary energy demand in this world is still primarily supplied by those bottom three bars, which are oil, natural gas, and coal. The reason I'm making this point is this is also true. And this truth is the answer to your question, Wayne, about what's the opportunity space still look like here? Because part of what has to happen is the world has to begin a transition away from these fossil fuel sources. And as you can see from the growth of these bars, not only are they, we actually aren't transitioning yet despite that growth. So the growth in renewables is filling new demand. The opportunity here is around the transition and the role that gas, and particularly LNG, can supply in the transition, both to that green bar and the gray bar, of displacing dirtier emitting sources of energy as we begin this transition from where we are to where we want to be as a planet around our emissions. One of the reasons that coal is still so popular is baseload demand. So those renewables I talked about earlier, it's true they're growing. It's also true they are intermittent sources of power. They must be firmed up. This is a clip from a website called the Carbon Brief. What it showed, this is India, this is China over here. And what it shows, the pink and purple blobs are coal-fired power plants that are either under construction today or planned to be constructed in the near future. And the orange blobs are existing coal-fired power plants that are in operation today. And so here we are again, the opportunity around climate change. Natural gas is a transition fuel. And you can see there are economies where, the US, Europe, where coal-fired baseload generation is coming off. But if you look at China, India, and others, it's still growing because you have to firm up these renewables. China is building a ton of renewables. They're also building a ton of baseload generation to firm them up. And this is an opportunity because of attention to climate change, but also because of the low cost of LNG right now. So while it's not good for profit making to have low prices, it's certainly good when you're convincing someone to be a transition fuel source of a lower emissions fuel like gas. The other point, in addition to low cost, the other thing that's really important in moving LNG right now and its opportunity space is the ability to not add to the climate problems of economies that wish to use LNG. There's no way to do net zero coal right now. You can, as we see here, this headline was only a few days ago where Total delivered a carbon neutral LNG cargo to its customer, which means when that customer burns that LNG in their power plants, they actually don't make their climate targets worse. And that's a massively important point for us to think about in this new context. And how they do it is they're sponsoring, wind projects and forest protection projects. The point being, there are verifiable, certifiable ways to offset the emissions in these cargoes for customers that wish to do so. And this slide just says that's not unique. It's happening everywhere. We're seeing these cargoes become a thing. And this is the sweet spot opportunity for Canada. When you couple it with my last point of countries themselves desiring to be net zero. So we have this reality happening in the world right now where countries all over the world are setting themselves targets to be net zero emissions and planning ways to get there. And they're all over the map on those plans. This headline was also just a few days ago, October 22nd, the world's third largest economy has now said, we're going to be net zero. That is a massive opportunity space for us to sell net zero cargoes into. And coupled with our domestic goals around net zero, which our government here has been talking about, is a massive opportunity. Canada is uniquely positioned to not only work with exporters around supplying these markets in this way, but we have an opportunity to actually produce LNG in a net zero fashion. And you couple those two ideas together, it's a powerful Canadian advantage. It's a powerful idea for Canada. And we can talk more about that as we go on.
We've already have a question from our guests here, Dave, which it relates to climate change. And the question is, are you optimistic for Article 6 or another mechanism for recognizing Canada's LNG as a global opportunity to reduce global emissions?
Yeah.
How is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very optimistic because this is, again, the Canadian brand, the Canadian advantage is we have a worldwide reputation as fair dealers and honest brokers. And if we say something is net zero, people tend to actually believe it, and it matters what Canada says in this space. And the best example I can give, again, just from within the last couple of weeks, Mark Carney, who has a very important role globally on this exact issue right now, has come out and talked very forcefully about the importance of a worldwide global carbon trading market in order to be able to help the planet meet its goals. And there's a ton of thinking that has gone on in this space that says, if we don't find a way to get ITMOs to work and to have a high quality, liquid, fair, honest trading of carbon credits around the world, there's really no incentive for the good actors to stretch their ambition even further. And that will be a huge drag on the globe's ability to meet its goals. Canada's opportunity is twofold. We have this massive wealth of clean energy in this country, across the country. We are blessed with abundance of 100% clean energy to power our projects. And we have massive forests and other carbon sinks. We have the ability to do carbon sequestration here, as Alberta has been demonstrating recently. We have a ton of ability to create credits and a massive incentive to be part of the foundation of creating that marketplace.
Thank you, Dave, for all those comments. Paul, you've been involved in this sector as a practicing lawyer for many years. So you've seen the LNG sector, all the high points and the low points. What's your view when we look ahead to LNG here in Canada?
Well, thanks for the question, Wayne. Like Dave, I'm around this game for a number of years, starting back at the beginning of the last decade, and there was a lot of positivism, then there was a lot of negativity, and I think we have to, as Dave says, approach this with a balanced view and look at the opportunity as opposed to the negatives. None of us are coming to this with a Pollyannish approach, but with regard to the opportunities that Dave has outlined, I think Canada has a really good opportunity here if policymakers, business leaders, and the public at large, which is a variety of stakeholders that Selena will address later, as well as others on this panel, if everybody would recognize that, we can look at this as a tremendous opportunity for Canada rather than thinking of all the negatives as to why it can't occur. And there's no reason why we can't do that. The only thing holding us back, I think, with regard to the LNG is ourselves. It's not international players. It's not what's happening in the United States. We are holding ourselves back, and at the same time, we can make ourselves go forward.
Thanks, Paul. I'm just trying to get a sense, and for us and for our guests here, as to how important is this sector when we look ahead. Alberta recently came out with a natural gas vision and strategy paper, which calls on new LNG facilities to be built close to tidewater. So, how important are these projects for the economies of Alberta, Western Canada, and even for Canada? And can they still be, or will they be, a critical element of of Canada's energy future? Who wants to take that on? Dave, back to you.
Sure, I can start. Well, I've been a supporter and bullish on Canadian LNG for a long time, and my optimism is not diminished, as I said a moment ago. And I think the recently released Alberta strategy was multifaceted. LNG was only one element of that strategy, but I thought it was excellent work. It truly was, and I think it's really important that we think about how to enable those kinds of ideas, because the benefits, to answer your question, are massive for us. I mean, they were important when our economy was humming on all cylinders and we had full employment and we had a surplus, in our budget making. These projects were important. In a post-COVID recovery world, and especially if we can do them in a way that we're proud of environmentally, both domestically and internationally, I think they're increasingly important. The revenues to governments are in the tens of billions of dollars of direct revenues in taxes and other revenues, direct sources. There's all of the jobs and the importance of jobs and high-paying, well-paying jobs. There's all the spin-off, purchasing and employment that goes with these projects. And then on top of that, there's all the royalties and the jobs in the upstream and in the extraction part of the story. And so, yeah, I think the importance is there. The strategy is as Paul said, is kind of laid out in front of us. The challenge is, are we up for it? And are we ambitious enough as a country?
Well, I think those of us who've been around a few years, saw how important the oil and gas sector was to get us out of the financial crisis in 2008 and 9. And now we have an oil and gas sector that has a lot of challenges. We need to get through that. But I agree with you. I think this is a way forward. That it's going to take us a while, but nonetheless, I think it's going to also take us some time to get through the COVID downturn, and we're going to need projects like these projects. I agree with you. Selena or Paul, would you want to comment on the importance of this sector to Canada?
I'll jump in. I mean, certainly I agree with Dave that LNG sector still represents an important element of Canada's energy future. I mean, Canada is one of the world's top 5 producers of natural gas, with that 2/3 of that production coming from Alberta. So, sort of in the before times, the Conference Board of Canada estimated about 56 million tons of, Canadian LNG production would increase our GDP by an average of more than 11 billion a year. So that's quite significant, of course. And certainly the pandemic has introduced, uncertainty into, our economic forecasts. But with the next window for LNG, sort of significant LNG supply coming in the mid to late 2020s, I think there's a great opportunity for us to kind of jump in there, as Paul sort of mentioned.
Thank you. Let's turn to some of the, I guess I would call them hurdles when it comes to LNG development. And one we hear a lot about are the regulatory matters pertaining to these new investments. Both domestic and international investors have been quite critical of the regulatory hurdles that these projects must now go through in this country. We have, for example, Bill C-69, which we've all heard a lot about, and BC, may I say, their newish EA Act. So what are some of these new regulatory hurdles that these pieces of legislation bring to the table, and are they insurmountable, or are we simply just living through a kind of a new set of regulations that we must manage as we go forward? Selena, I know this is an area that you've worked a lot on, so let me turn to you.
Sure, thanks, Wayne. Well, from a lawyer's perspective, no regulatory challenge is insurmountable with some good guidance, planning, and a large dose of patience. Proponents will be familiar with a lot of the core elements of the updated regulatory review processes, both federally and provincially. But there are some new components, which represent new territory for many. So, but over time, I expect that data analytics and methodologies will be developed and refined, which will support the nature of the type of decision making which is contemplated under these new processes. So, as many of you know, Bill C-69 was first introduced back in February of 2018. with a view to really reinvigorating federal environmental assessment, energy, and navigable waters regulatory regimes. The new Impact Assessment Act came into force in August of 2019, which really moved us away from a consideration of the straight environmental effects of designated projects towards a broader assessment of project impacts, which includes impacts on social and health matters, the economy and Indigenous peoples, and in each case looking at impacts on current and future generations. So a determination of whether a designated project should go ahead now requires a consideration of whether it's in the public interest, of course. But now it also considers how it contributes to sustainability and whether it will help Canada reach its climate change commitments. As I understand, there's currently two actually LNG projects that are undergoing an impact assessment under the new act. The Gazduk pipeline, which is the proposed 780 kilometer underground natural gas transmission line that will run between northeastern Ontario and Saguenay, which will support a future LNG export facility there, as well as the Cedar LNG project. So as these and other new projects undergo an impact assessment, they entered, in some aspects, uncharted waters. So I'll touch upon two of these components under the Act. The first is sustainability, and the second is gender-based analysis plus, or GBA plus. So sustainability features quite prominently throughout the impact assessment process, and proponents are required to determine the extent to which a project contributes to sustainability. The minister or the governor and council's public interest determination also needs to consider sustainability as one of the 5 factors when it's rendering its final decision. So under the Impact Assessment Act, sustainability has been defined as the ability to protect the environment, contribute to the social and economic well-being of Canadians, and to preserve their health in a manner that benefits present and future generations. This means that sustainability is highly contextual. It's tied to human and ecological systems, and it's project dependent. So how this will translate into a consistent approach, which is flexible enough to reflect the different values among different stakeholders, is something I think that proponents will need to will struggle with under these new guidelines. Environment and Climate Change Canada has provided guidance on sustainability and what it means and how a project contributes to sustainability, and they've provided a lens which is based on 4 principles, which include sort of considering the interconnectedness and interdependence of human ecological systems, the well-being of present and future generations, the positive effects and reduction of adverse impacts of designated projects, as well as the application of the precautionary principle to take into account uncertainty and the risk of irreversible harm. So this is how Environment and Climate Change Canada has kind of framed sustainability. Another sufficiently vague concept is the application of the GBA plus in the impact assessment process. So GBA plus is an analytical framework that provides guidance on how to ask vulnerable population groups about the potential positive and negative effects under the Impact Assessment Act. In particular, the goal of GBA plus is to understand how a project might affect diverse groups of people differently, and to identify ways to address these impacts to ensure more equitable distribution of benefits where possible. Although the GBA plus framework is not a new concept and has been applied in different project contexts over the past decade, it's now a formal requirement under the Act. One of the challenges of applying GBA plus is that it's an analytical tool. It's a way of thinking as opposed to a specific set of prescribed methods. So the methods and tools which are used to carry out the GBA plus analysis can include a whole range of tools, including statistics, interviews on the ground, and community forums. And so the appropriate methods will depend on the community and project context. Proponents will really need to provide a rationale for the methodologies applied, including literature references, best practices, and community input. GBA plus is expected to be integrated into all aspects of the assessment, including those which are led by the agency and those that are led by the proponent. And this is expected to kind of go from the early planning stages all the way to compliance and enforcement. Before I move on to sort of some of the provincial challenges at the provincial level, I'll see if Paul has any comments there, or Dave.
No, I think you've accurately captured Bill C-69 and some of the highlights of it. I know Dave's had a view about this in terms of how international investors look at our changing regulatory landscape. That he and I both traveled throughout Asia extensively on the LNG portfolio, and I think it's an interesting perspective that Dave has learned about.
We'll come back to you, Dave. Selena, just talk a little bit about BC's environmental assessment changes.
Sure, absolutely. So at the provincial level, proponents also face new requirements under the sort of new EA or newish EA process, as we're calling it. Back in the spring of 2018, BC introduced a process to revitalize the provincial environmental assessment process. And in December of last year, the new Environmental Assessment Act came into force. So many of the changes that it introduced are consistent with the changes made under the federal regime, such as early engagement and greater opportunities for public participation. One area that kind of goes beyond the federal IA approach is the area of Indigenous consultation. So the updated provincial EA process reforms the way in which Indigenous communities are engaged and consulted. While the consultation previously under the 2002 Act was driven by a strength of claim assessment, the new EA process provides an opportunity for Indigenous groups to put their hand up and notify the EAO of their intent to participate in an EA review process if they're going to be adversely affected by the project. While the chief EA officer has the discretion to deny a group's participation if there's no reasonable possibility that they'll be impacted by the project, we expect that the threshold for the right to participate will be pretty low. Groups that don't identify themselves will still be identified and consulted by the EAO. So the updated environmental assessment process introduces a consensus-based model of decision-making with Indigenous groups. So the EAO is required to seek to achieve consensus at two decision stages. The first is at the readiness decision stage, which is the sort of go, no-go decision early on. And later on, when it decides whether to issue an EA certificate. Where consensus can't be achieved, there is a dispute resolution mechanism that will be available to the parties. And although the EAO can ultimately proceed without full consensus, we expect there'll be a pretty high bar for them to meet in order to proceed without consensus. BC's updated EA process also formalizes the establishment of technical advisory committees, which are forums for independent technical reviews of the proponent's documents and technical studies. Members include participating Indigenous participating nations, federal and provincial representatives, local government representatives, and subject matter experts. I think the challenge for proponents is that committee members may not have the required expertise necessarily required to review the documents and studies. And what happens, in the event of disagreement between the proponent's experts and the committee's experts. So, you have that sort of battle of experts on sensitive issues, particularly politically sensitive environmental issues. I don't know if Paul has any other thoughts.
No, good to go.
Okay. Well, I think the question is, and Dave, you've lived the regulatory making from the other side like me. You were the drafter of regulations. How do you see all this? This is, as I said, we've heard a lot of concerns about this, particularly from the oil and gas sector. What's your perspective on all of these new regulatory, hurdles that these projects must now go through?
It's a really important point because it is a bit of a catch-22. There's no doubt that the changes that Selena talked about and that the governments have made raise the bar. And when the bar is higher, it's harder to get over. That is true. However, there's also a positive aspect to having the bar high when you turn to this growing concern on ESG that I talked about earlier, or climate change, and speaking to our citizens and our companies and saying, like, how proud can we be if we can achieve this bar is the question. And I think that's really, really an important aspect of this. And I can tell you that the question that remains to be answered is, once the bar raises to a point that it's impossible to get over, that's not good either. But I don't think we've established that with Bill C-69 or the new EA Act in BC yet. I think that movie's still to be written. And what's really interesting is, as we move the first sets of projects through these new rules, governments have an opportunity here to prove the naysayers wrong. To say, the bar was never intended to be impossible to get over. It was intended to be set higher, but not to an impossible place. So I think we're all incentivized on all sides to try to, prove the naysayers wrong. And to the point Paul asked a little bit about what's happening overseas with foreign direct investment and how they see this whole movie is quite interesting because, again, they would prefer always to have a simpler system than a more complex one to work against. But what terrifies them far more than Bill C-69 when it comes to foreign direct investment in Canada is the worry that the regulatory environment will continue to be whipsawed. And so the politics of creating a political football out of the regulatory environment is really, really bad news for foreign direct investment. They will enter a hard game and play a hard game and work their way over that bar if they're confident that it's not going to continually move on them. What's death to that investment conversation is if they believe they'll get halfway through a process and then the rules are going to change again. And so that idea that the regulatory space is political rather than technical is a huge drag on FDI.
Yeah, I think, and it's not that other countries are upping their game on the regulatory side as well. So investors see that, but I think it is true that when it comes to foreign direct investment, this, as you say, being whipsawed on the environmental regulatory side is also a real issue. And I know, everyone thinks, well, maybe we'll see a change in government and we'll go back. And some of that probably will happen. But there are some other impacts. I think it's also the case that, and I think many of on the podcast here today, I think they assume that the environmental assessment folks are ravaging environmentalists and never want to see a project go ahead. I don't think that's the case. My experience is that, yes, they must carry forward with the law, but in the end of the day, they are trying to find a balance here and they want to see some of these projects go ahead. So I think it's where we're at. I think the companies are going to have to, which they are doing, will have to focus on this and move forward to get their project's approval. It is going to be difficult in the early days because all of these a lot of terminology and a lot of commitments are new. But it clearly is a challenge. Another one that I think we've already talked a bit about is climate change. Our current government is very serious about climate change, and they are looking to increase the greenhouse targets beyond the 30% reduction by 2030 and moving to net zero by 2050. But governments are not alone in looking for concrete actions from companies to deal with CO2 emissions. We see lenders, investors, and consumers are all looking to firms to step up their greenhouse reduction efforts. So how will this impact LNG? And I know, Dave, you've already talked a bit about this. And how can these projects contribute to climate change? So, Dave, are there other points you would like to add here in addition to what you've already commented on?
Thanks, Wayne. And just maybe to build on my net zero comments of earlier is what I'd like to do. So and also the idea of, the political football that is climate change in the regulatory space. And honestly, I look for where's the consensus, where's the opportunity for consensus and for working together as a country and supporting, back to Alberta and their recent strategy. How do we support each other, nationally to do the right thing in the right way? And where is that consensus around climate potential? And the great news is we're seeing from the business community are rallying around that same idea. So, we've got reports coming out of Conference Board, like the Rising Tide report. We've got the BC Business Council report, the Alberta Business Council. Others are trying to create that political space for compromise. I think the pragmatic environmental community doing the same thing, trying to find a way to support net zero and things like generation energy and things like that, and trying to really find a way to be supportive. And so, when you add that up and you look at the policy frame of net zero nationally, what's wrong with that? Like, I look at that and say, I think we can create a win-win-win there to say we can get the benefits, we can get that economic development we talk about, the jobs, the revenues to governments. We can get First Nations in on the ground floor as partners and make them full-on going concern supportive partnerships there. We can do it with net zero without adding to the GHG problem that is the Canadian, as we strive to reduce emissions in our economy to meet our Paris targets. We need not make the problem worse by building these projects. We can do them in a net zero way if we had the policy framework to do that. And we can export into that global environment by displacing dirtier fuels. Like, not only forget about replacing coal, like I talked about earlier, by being in the game, we can push out dirtier LNG. There's a lot of countries, pretty much every other country that's producing LNG right now does not have our aspirations as Canadians when it comes to climate. So why not be in that market, producing locally at net zero and pushing those dirtier LNG sources and other sources out of the market? Because the simple thing is demand is demand is demand. The world demand is the world demand for LNG. The only question is who should supply it and under what terms. And I think the final thing we can do is we can set that bar. We can show the world as Canadians that it's possible. And we don't need to buy into this fake argument about you have to choose jobs in the economy and an oil fossil fuel industry, or you can choose the environment and you must only pick one. We have a chance here when you add up these ideas to show the world you can actually, you don't have to subscribe to that argument. You can actually do both.
Paul, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, all LNG is not all equal. I mean, there's different types of LNG, and I think that's a missing factor that, the general public doesn't understand by and large, or has trouble understanding. That Dave's concept of Canadian LNG being different than dirty LNG is something that I think, the government, I think, needs to take a leadership position on. Obviously, business can do that, but with the government taking that view, that is a fundamental part of a Canadian energy strategy, which many of us think that Canada needs, particularly in a post-pandemic world. But I think, when we talk about that on a macro level with LNG across the world, that's helpful, but it's also helpful internally, and that creates opportunities in Canada. And I think Selena will be talking, I think Wayne, you're going to direct her to have some conversation about the role of LNG plays with developing opportunities for Indigenous nations to take advantage of this great opportunity. And I think that really plays into it on a domestic level as well.
Well, that leads me to the next question, which is dealing with Indigenous people. We know that over the last number of years, there's been growing recognition that resource project proponents, like the LNG proponents, must take into consideration the concerns and aspirations of Indigenous peoples in this country. And we know the views of Indigenous communities are mixed. Some are very supportive of projects like the ones we're talking about today, resource projects, but others are quite opposed. We've also seen the BC government recently pass legislation supporting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and the federal government is planning to do the same thing. So Selena, let me turn to you. Can you shed some light on what does this all mean for LNG development in Canada, and perhaps the LNG Canada model, which has dealt with First Nations and Aboriginal people as part of their moving forward. Maybe it is a model moving forward in looking at some of these other projects. So, what's your views on this?
Thanks, Wayne. As Paul mentioned, sustainably developed LNG industry in Canada represents a really, I think, meaningful opportunity for Indigenous peoples to partner in economic development. And that's development that not only brings skills and training and jobs to its members, but also increase revenue and growth for their communities so that they can invest, in their infrastructure and projects for the future generations. Sustainable energy projects are also good news stories that Indigenous leaders can showcase and share within their communities. And these are all things that I think sort of lift up these communities. Through the province's adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think BC is really demonstrating its commitment to lasting reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. The LNG industry is definitely at the forefront of partnering with First Nations to ensure that real benefits reach these communities, all the while sort of ensuring that the long-term sustainability of LNG projects. I'll let Dave speak to the specific agreements benefiting local groups such as the Haisla. But my own experience in Aboriginal law goes back, more than a decade, back to the 2008 Clean Power Call, when we saw a proliferation of First Nation partnerships in the clean energy sector. Since then, my practice has sort of evolved from drafting, the standard IBAs and process documents to procurement now and establishing business partnerships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups. I think this reflects a desire of Indigenous groups to move from being simply sort of passive participants in projects to being real business owners and business partners in the truest sense of the word. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has said that reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. And in order for that to happen, there has to be an awareness of the past, an acknowledgement of the harm that's been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. As you noted, Wayne, there's a diversity of views among Indigenous communities on how to move forward with resource development in Canada. For me, essential components of reconciliation include communication and transparency. It's an ongoing process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships. And I'll finish on this note, which is the sentiment is perhaps best captured by an observation of one of the residential school survivors, Betsy Anatak, who had provided a statement to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And she said that, quote, "By listening to your story, my story can change. By listening to your story, I can change." And I think that really captures the sentiment of reconciliation moving forward.
Thanks. That's a very good quote, Selena. Dave, you again has some real hands-on experience with working with Indigenous peoples and at the same time trying to move forward with some of the resource projects in BC. Do you have any comments on this?
So, yeah, sure. Yes, I have a ton of experience both in LNG, but also mining. I was the deputy looking after pipelines. So yeah, lots of give and take there and lots of experience. And what I would say is, it's through working with First Nations and the Indigenous peoples in BC that I've had, honestly, my most fulfilling part of my career. Like I've seen it all, been there, been in very controversial situations, but come out of a lot of it with many of these First Nations leaders as my personal friends, which will be lifelong friends. And what I've learned is that, just like any community, there's a wide spectrum of personalities involved. But as a general statement, First Nations just want in the door. They want a piece of the puzzle. They want to be part of this. They want to be part of the benefits. They want to be part of the regulatory space. They want to make sure it's safe and clean and well done, but they are not against development. And again, that's a general statement. There's always exceptions to that, and I respect those exceptions. And as Grand Chief Stuart Phillip is famous for saying here in British Columbia, reconciliation is not for wimps. This is hard stuff. It is a different deal for corporations and for governments and for the nations themselves and their people. But I tell you, of all the communities out there I've seen that are up for a different way of doing things, it's the Indigenous and First Nations communities. And I tell you, the groups that have arisen, through many of the LNG efforts here in BC, we've got the First Nations LNG Alliance, the First Nations Climate Initiative, the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, and nationally we've got groups like Project Reconciliation and others working on pipelines and other endeavors. I think we're on a journey with what that's going to look like, and I think we're early in that journey. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch the emergence of leadership coming from that community as this story unfolds, of how we're going to, back to this idea of net zero as the climate part of ESG, but when it comes to the S part of ESG and how countries and corporations and projects are treating and working with their local Indigenous peoples, I think Canada's got a great story to tell there.
Yeah, I agree with that, David. I think my experience as well, dealing with many Indigenous communities and also resource projects, is that, and as Selena alluded to this as well, I mean, it is changing the nature of their involvement. They want to now be true participants. And I think when we talk about Aboriginal reconciliation, it means being active participants in the ownership, in some cases, of these projects. Yes, there are jobs, there are revenues, but actual being equity holders in these projects, I think, is the way we're going. It's the way of the future, and I think many of these LNG proponents are going to need to get into those conversations as these projects move ahead. So, well, look, everyone, thank you, panelists. We are coming to the end of our Q&A session. A lot of interesting subject matters that we discussed when it comes to the future of LNG in Canada. So let me turn it to the audience here to see if any of you have any questions that you want to ask, either by way of the chat at the bottom, or just unmute your mic and pose a question. So let me just turn it over to any of you to see if there's anything you want to, a question or a comment that you want to add. I won't stay silent too long. Hearing none, I want to thank everyone, but before I conclude our session, let me just turn it back to the panelists to see if there's anything else they would like to add by way of any concluding comments. Paul?
No, I want to express my thanks to all the people who've attended today. I hope it's been helpful, and look forward to chatting with you in the future about the opportunities that particularly Dave and Selena have outlined.
Selena?
Nothing to add, just a warm thanks to everyone for attending. I know it's a bit of an awkward format, so appreciate all your attention, and hopefully look forward to an in-person meeting. I'll look forward to that.
And Dave, what's it like working for a law firm now that after you've been a public servant for how many years?
I must say, quite enjoyable. I was actually going to be part of my closing comment is just to thank McCarthy for welcoming me and giving me this platform, and it's awesome, and yeah, happy if there is questions afterwards. You know where to find us. We're easy to look up and happy to engage. Thanks everyone.
There is one question that's come up, which is how can we achieve meaningful ownership by First Nations of these projects? What do we need to do to ensure that there is ownership?
So I can start. It's the number one issue that makes it hard for First Nations to take actual equity in a project is they don't have money. It's a real fundamental issue that, the old saying, it takes money to make money, is true for them as well. And so part of the answer is going to be found in governments as part of their reconciliation mandates and initiatives, is to find ways to give that capacity to First Nations without strings so that they can then turn around and invest in projects, be it a mine, be it a power line, be it a LNG, whatever. And we're seeing that play out initially, I think, in some of these pipeline projects. So, I hear some good things happening around Coastal GasLink and potential equity, ideas there, where the government of BC is stepping in to help with that. And so I think you're going to see that play out more positively as time goes on. And then once nations can create self-source revenues, you can create a bit of a snowball there.
Yeah, I think there's going to need to be some momentum given to this. And I think government needs to play a critical role, which I think they are prepared to do. We look at the Trans Mountain Pipeline, where I think there's an interest on the part of the federal government to have First Nations own part of that pipeline. And I think once they determine what that will be, I suspect the government will provide some form of concessional financing to help the First Nations or Aboriginal people become part owners in the project. I was a federal negotiator for the government in the sale of the rail line from La Paz, Manitoba to Churchill, Manitoba a couple of years ago, where First Nations and Northern communities now own 50% of that. Well, that 50% equity was financed by the government. So I think there are other examples out there. Governments are going to have to step up. But I think as well, you see other concepts arising. For example, as these projects, as Dave said, as First Nations come on board, they generate a return. And some of the First Nations are talking about creating a wealth fund, or wealth funds, that part of the revenues from their equity ownership would go into the wealth fund and therefore be available for other First Nations and other Aboriginal people to participate in these projects. And perhaps it's something the oil and gas sector want to help finance as well. Not only governments, but the oil and gas sector provide funding to a wealth fund to allow First Nations to take an equity ownership. And it also involves building capacity within First Nations communities. I think they are the first to admit that some of them are very sophisticated and can be participants, equity participants, but others are going to have to come along. And so there's a learning curve here that we need to go through as well. So I think a lot of factors at play, but there needs to be a will. There needs to be a will on the part of the proponents, and there needs to be a will on the part of the government. And I think that takes place. I think we can find a win-win situation for everyone. I'm just looking here. I'm sorry, at the chat line. And seeing no other questions. Again, let me first thank our three panelists for their contributions here today. Thank you, colleagues. Great comments. Great perspective. Clearly, we have a sector here that, as we talked about, have gone through a lot of ups and downs. But I think from what you heard today, and I know many of you are directly involved in some of these projects, it's going to take a lot of work. There's some of those regulatory hurdles, some other challenges, but I think it's a sector that is well positioned for the future here in Canada. And it's going to help continue to diversify our energy sector and grow our Canadian economy. And so, I look forward to watching this sector evolve and hopefully being part of it as these projects come on board. And for those of you who are involved in LNG projects that are on the line, we wish you the best of luck as you bring these forward. And to all of you who have participated, thank you for doing so. We appreciate your involvement, and please feel free to follow up with us. I have an email. It's called calgaryevents@mccarthy.ca. If you wish to raise any further questions or have any further comments, we will be pleased to assist you in any questions that you may have. For that, let's sign off. Thank you, everybody. Good luck. Stay safe. Goodbye.